situations. Now, we have to bear in mind that cortisol and adrenaline and noradrenaline are only one of a number of mediators that also includes parasympathetic activity, both inflammatory pro- and anti-inflammatory cytokines, another steroid, DHEA, another adrenal steroid, and oxidative stress, which is generated by the interactions between these mediators. And a little bit of oxidative stress is, of course, good for you, essential for the operation of cells, but too much is too much, and it can cause damage to DNA and destroy cells. The main point of this slide is to say that cortisol and sympathetic activity are part of a network of mediators which are biphasic and which are nonlinear because they each influence the other networks in complex ways. Moreover, these mediators, this system, this network of allostasis, as we call it, is dysregulated by an unhealthy lifestyle, poor sleep, toxic chemicals in the environment. These feed into this network and, for example, elevate inflammation. They may elevate cortisol. They may suppress parasympathetic activity. They may generate too much oxidative stress. And then you have allostatic load and damage to not just to the cardiovascular system, but to the immune system, to the metabolic system, and also to the brain. Now, in the New England Journal paper, we described different ways that this allostasis system can be dysregulated. Normally, it should turn on and turn off efficiently, and then you get the maximum benefit. You get adaptation without so much, bad consequences. But if this individual response goes up and stays up, then that can cause problems. If it does not go up adequately, for example, if your cortisol doesn't go up enough, then other systems overreact. There may be too much inflammation. And then if we look at individual responses over time, that is multiple responses over time, you see that simply having too much stress, a lot of events in your life, can cause a wear and tear. But also, if you are exposed to the same stress, normally one might habituate to it and not react the same way every time. But there are people and situations in which there is no habituation and in which even with the same re-exposure to stressor, it continues to cause responses which can accelerate the allostatic load. Now, when we talk about stress, we often mean some different things. So, for example, there is positive stress, responding to a personal challenge that has a satisfying outcome, like giving a talk, which is well received, doing something where you're taking a risk but you feel rewarded. And people have then a sense of mastery and control. And to do this, you have to have healthy brain architecture and good self-esteem, good judgment, and impulse control. You can have tolerable stress. Something really bad happens, somebody loses a job, a death of a loved one. And these are, however, buffered by supportive relationships, by healthy brain architecture, by good self-esteem, judgment, and impulse control, and above all, also by good external support. And one then survives, copes with it and recovers. And then you can have toxic stress, which would be maybe the same kind of adverse events, maybe more severe, but the basic problem is the person may not have a good, healthy brain architecture, and as a result may have dysregulated physiologic systems, more allostatic load, in part because they can't cope with it. They don't have the physical and external support, and as a result can develop over time both physical and mental health disorders. And I think we often then talk about toxic stress when we talk about the negative aspects of stress. Now, there's something which, at least in the English language, means something to most everybody, and that's being stressed out. And this is meaning feeling overwhelmed, out of control, exhausted, anxious, frustrated, and even angry. And what happens? For example, for something bad happens in your life, you fester about it, you lose sleep at night, you eat too many of the wrong things, drink too much alcohol, smoke, and neglect your regular physical activity, which is basically good for you, but you're too busy to do that, or you don't have the opportunities to do that. All of these contribute to allostatic load. So psychosocial stress is a major factor contributing to dysregulation of the network of allostasis and allostatic load. When you're sleep deprived, there is, for a period of time, like 4 or 5 hours a night for several nights, there's increased blood pressure, decreased parasympathetic tone, increased levels of cortisol in the evening, glucose, insulin, elevated levels of inflammatory cytokines, increased appetite, which can also increase the first 3 if you take in too many calories. There also can be, as we well know, depressed mood and impaired cognitive function. Now, these can be reversed, particularly in younger people, by recovery sleep. So they are not irreversible, but one of the great problems in our society is the problem of sleep deprivation leading to obesity. Now, let's talk about the brain as a target for stress and stress hormones, and what happens to the brain when there is both acute and chronic stress. We're going to talk about 3 areas of the brain. One area you already know about, the hippocampus. Besides its role in memory, it's also involved in shutting off the cortisol response to stress. We're going to talk about the amygdala, which is involved in emotions, fear and anxiety, and also in aggression. And it turns on the cortisol stress response and also the autonomic response. And then there's the prefrontal cortex, the medial prefrontal cortex in particular, which is very important for decision making, for working memory, for top-down control of impulsive behavior, but also for the regulation of autonomic and the HPA, the cortisol system. So when things happen structurally and functionally in each of these brain areas, they affect these cognitive and vegetative processes. Now, one of the most important aspects of what I have to tell you about the brain is that the brain circuits can be remodeled. Dendrites of nerve cells can grow or shrink as a result of experience, including stressful experiences. Synapses on dendritic spines, which drive the excitatory input to these cells, turn over. They can be replaced, they can be downregulated, they can be induced, and there's a limited amount of neurogenesis that takes place in the hippocampus in particular. So in the hippocampus, where we've and others have done the most work, this is a circuit. This is the dentate gyrus, which connects to the CA3, which then connects to the CA1. It's called the trisynaptic circuit. Information comes into the hippocampus from the entorhinal cortex. This input degenerates in Alzheimer's disease. People then can't remember things as well. And what happens, this circuit is a very complex circuit with feedback loops and feed-forward loops, and it's very sensitive to damage from seizures. And what we found is that with repeated stress, the apical dendrites of these neurons actually become shorter and less branched, as shown here compared to unstressed animal. The basal dendrites don't change. What drives this is the mossy fiber input of giant synapses that release glutamate here on the base of these apical dendrites. And here's the neurogenesis in the dentate gyrus that I spoke about, which can also be reduced by stress, but on the other side it can be increased by things like regular exercise. And in fact, here's an example of an experiment where we chronically stressed rats 2 hours a day of restraint for up to 6 weeks, and we saw a decrease in neurogenesis shown here, which became significant after 6 weeks. There was, after 6 weeks, a net decrease in the number of granule cells and in the volume of the dentate gyrus. So we actually were able to shrink this part of the brain with chronic stress. Now, going back to the dendritic remodeling, which you see here, we can mimic this by giving chronic treatment with glucocorticoids, with cortisol or corticosterone. But we know that it also involves the release of glutamate because we can block this with agents that block excitatory transmission. And moreover, when an animal is acutely stressed, we know that there is an increase in extracellular glutamate. This study done some time ago used microdialysis, and it also showed that if you adrenalectomize the animal, this elevation of glutamate doesn't take place. So glucocorticoids are able to facilitate the release of glutamate. Under chronic stress, this elevation does not shut off. So it's an example of that failure to shut off, and that's what may cause the dendrites to shrink. So it's not surprising that with chronic stress, we can prevent this remodeling by blocking glucocorticoid synthesis, but also by blocking the NMDA receptors with antagonists, by using lithium and dilantin, which are anti-epileptic excitatory agents, by certain antidepressants, by a benzodiazepine, and also by a deficiency of brain-derived neurotropic factor. So there are many, many factors that are involved in this very important process, but the important thing to point out is that when you stop the stress or the glucocorticoid treatment, this is reversible. So this is not brain damage, it's not cell loss, it's plasticity. And in fact, this is the way we think about it. Acutely, adrenal steroids and excitatory amino acids facilitate excitation. They help promote certain aspects of memory. Higher levels acutely cause a suppression of the same responses, so we get our inverted U. And then chronic stress, just as I've described, suppresses neurogenesis and causes this dendritic shrinkage that I've shown you. But this is reversible. But then if you have a crisis, a head injury, seizures, or a stroke, then adrenal steroids and excitatory amino acids work together to cause permanent, irreversible brain damage. What we think is that this adaptive plasticity may help to protect the brain against permanent damage by reducing its potential to be excited and damage itself. But at the same time, we're beginning to see evidence that there is a destabilization and even perhaps a cumulative, shall we say, allostatic load that will make that brain more vulnerable to damage later on. So it's not without its negative consequences.